Welcome to our podcast today. My name is Douglas Gabriel. Today I'm going to be talking about something that really gets me excited, and you may find it surprising that it's a fairy tale. But I'd like to present to you some of the background information and a bit about Rudolf Steiner's interpretation of Goethe's fairy tale called The Green Snake and Beautiful Lily. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in 1795 wrote this fairy tale as an answer to his friend Friedrich Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Mankind. He did it as a contribution to a new magazine that Schiller and Goethe and friends were creating called The Hours. Initially, it was called Conversations of German Immigrants. Now, I'd like to explain first off a little bit about fairy tales and about how this came about, and then I'd like to go into Rudolf Steiner's interpretations and commentaries on this particular fairy tale and its significance in his life. But I'd also like to mention that in the notes below, there will be a URL that can connect you to the article that was written in relationship to this. In the article, it first off begins with a historical perspective, framing the creation of this fairy tale. Secondly, it goes into what might be called a synopsis, a condensed synopsis of Rudolf Steiner's that he gave in two lectures, because Rudolf Steiner started lecturing first to the Theosophical Society on this very fairy tale. It was such a profound thing to him and others at the time that they considered it to be one of the spiritual paths into initiation. So it's something that he addressed many times throughout his lectures, and the condensation of that summary, or somewhat of a synopsis of it, is the first thing after the historical introduction. And then, because this fairy tale is so complicated to understand, and I can tell you that though I've read it many times, and I actually rewrote it into a play for second graders in the Waldorf school that I was teaching, I can say that I have never understood it until recently, when it finally came to rest in my mind as a full explanation of the exactly what Steiner says it is, a condensation of the mysteries of ancient times, ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, ancient Persians, ancient Greeks, and their mystery dramas, which today, even in Europe, they still do mystery dramas concerning the life of Christ. And these mystery dramas are, in fact, like the Greek dramas. It brings a catharsis through the process of going through what it is that the characters represent and realizing that all the characters, according to Rudolf Steiner and those who interpret fairy tales, all the characters in the fairy tale are you. They are different components of yourself. And when you understand that, then the fairy tales can really bring forth their deeper meaning. And then after that synopsis is the fairy tale itself. As Goethe was asked many times, please give an interpretation of what these symbols mean, who these characters are. Well, no one really has until Rudolf Steiner, because they are so profound and so deep that there really is no end to what you can extrapolate from or lay over the top of this fairy tale in terms of deep, deep meanings of the soul reaching up to wed the spirit. And so I have gone through a variety of Rudolf Steiner's lectures and gathered together his commentary and his interpretation of the 20 or so characters in the story and congealed them into a synopsis, into a condensed version of describing who those characters are. And I give that at that point because otherwise, when you read it, you might not be able to really understand it, and the mysteries that are implicit in it can confound you. And when Goethe was asked again and again, please give us interpretations, he said, no, let the symbols speak for themselves. But I can tell you, after reading it probably 20 times, I still didn't understand the symbols. And also, it's good to have that up front. And then when you read the story, then you can begin to see the profound nature of this fairy tale. And then after Thomas Carlyle's translation of this fairy tale, The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily of Goethe's, is a few more selections of Rudolf Steiner's that would add more to what it is that he gave in the synopsis, which is the second part of this article. So the article is about it's quite long, but it includes Thomas Carlyle's translation. And as Thomas Carlyle said, I will uh, paraphrase what he said about this fairy tale. He said that this was the most noble performance or creation in the last 1,000 years since the Dark Ages. Imagine that there could be such a thing as great scholars saying that a fairy tale has more wisdom in it than any other thing that has been written in philosophy, in drama, in other plays, or in other places. Religious dogma, doctrine do not compare to what Goethe has presented here. Now, many people may find that rather ridiculous. And if you read the story without knowing the symbols, then you might think, oh, very nice story. Oh, I kind of get what it's saying, and it's very nice, la di da. But in fact, there is no end to the depth that one can glean from a deep and profound research into this, what was called Wonder Tale, or as Goethe called it, the glorious tale of the green snake and beautiful lily, or as many people have come to call it, the tale of tales. Well, to talk about a historical backdrop, let us first say a few things. Friedrich Schiller was a close friend of Goethe's, and he, of course, wrote plays, very profound plays, but he wrote a series of letters that are called the Letters on the Ascetic Education of Mankind. Some people believe that they are the most profound philosophical statement ever made. And in it, to give you a synopsis of it, it is talking about how we go from necessity to freedom, how we go from being bound to being a free individual. And in these letters, Schiller is addressing as commentary the governmental conditions of his time, the political conditions of his time, the nature of nations and the place of the individual in those nations. Well, Goethe doesn't get into that specifically, but if one understands the profound imagery that he gives us concerning the four kings in this story, then you can see that he was making absolutely political commentary upon how an individual goes from necessity, goes from basically their desires and their passions in their soul to reaching up and wedding the being of their spirit. Goethe said in conversations with Schiller that what he really wanted to do as his first article for this new magazine called The Hours was, in fact, a retelling of the story of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. Christian Rosenkreuz, of course, is the mythical founder of Rosicrucianism, and there are three principal works that were written. One of them is The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, and two others are basically The Fame and the Fraternity of the Rosicrucians and the Rosicrucian Brotherhoods described by Johann Valentin Andreas, who was a Unity Brethren minister, which is also called the Bohemian Brotherhood. Well, Rudolf II, the Habsburg emperor, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, allowed the freedom of expression for this Unity Brethren, this Bohemian Brotherhood, and eventually, because his brother wanted to take the throne from him and he moved from Vienna to Prague, there was the Battle of White Mountain, which was the beginning of the 30 Years' War in Europe, where it was more or less the papacy responding to what could be called the movement of the Reformation. In other words, non-Catholics being fought by the Catholics. And so at that time, the Bohemian Brotherhood, which had been given religious freedom in the kingdom of Rudolf II, had to go underground. As a matter of fact, they eventually became what were called the Wandering Bohemians or the Gypsies. And they took their wisdom that they had at the time, which was a Protestant wisdom that tapped into the great secrets of the past, the mysteries or ancient mysteries of the past, of India, of Persia, of Egypt, of Chaldea, Babylonia, Sumeria, of the ancient Greeks, and they put them into what you might call mystery puzzles. One of the things that they're most noted for is they were the group of people who were fortune tellers, and that they used what is called the Book of the Tarot, or the tarot cards. And in these cards are supposedly the mystery wisdom of the past. Well, they also created this organization that was against the papacy and tried to show that Christian Rosenkreuz, who some say was in fact a historical individual, he had traveled to the East and he had gained all the wisdom of the East, and he came back to Europe and basically created the Rosicrucian movement, and that this was a universal movement, but that it was secret and that it was practically underground, as it were, just like the Subterranean Temple that's referenced in The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily. And in his crypt, the crypt of Christian Rosenkreuz, was supposedly the wisdom of the ancients. Well, Johann Valentin Andreas later called the Chemical Wedding and the other two Rosicrucian initial works a ludubrium, a joke, a parody, and he basically tried to completely state that they were simply a political statement of the time that should really not be given much credence. As a matter of fact, he distanced himself from those three works, which today are the foundation of the many different Rosicrucian movements that can be found throughout the world. And he turned over the bishopric, the head bishop position of the Unity Brethren, to Amos Comenius, who is a very famous person who wrote one of the most famous books of the time. As a matter of fact, Goethe called his second favorite book was the work of Amos Comenius called Orbis Pictus, The World in Pictures. But this was the opposite tendency of what Goethe was trying to get across in The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily. He was showing us through symbols and not through pictures which had annotations. Amos Comenius, The World in Pictures, there would be a picture on one side and on the other side, and they would be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, and then with the images that are inside of the picture, and then off to the side was a commentary on what those images were, so that a child could say, aha, we're in a printing shop, and this is the printing press, and these are the letters, and this is the ink, and this is so on and so forth. And this would be done with every element of life, the world in pictures. It led to our modern educational philosophy. So Comenius is considered to be the father of modern education through this particular book. But what we believe is that The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily was the world not in pictures, but the world in symbols. And so you can find just about any aspect of soul development striving towards the spirit in this story if you look closely. And as Goethe said to Schiller, he wished to rewrite The Chemical Wedding, but in a new form that would hardly be able to be recognized from its original source. So from the beginning, Goethe said that this fairy tale, this wonder tale, this glorious tale, was in fact a reinterpretation of The Chemical Wedding, or as we could say, the deep teachings of the Rosicrucians. Now, Rudolf Steiner in his commentary says that essentially The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily, as well as Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of humanity or mankind, were the inspiration, but particularly The Green Snake and Beautiful Lily was the inspiration for his four mystery dramas. Those four mystery dramas, The Portal of Initiation being the one that he cited most closely, was inspired by The Green Snake and Beautiful Lily of Goethe, harken back to the time of the Greeks. Aeschylus and Sophocles created dramas, plays, that were an ability for the souls of the Greeks to go through catharsis, to go through an entire process that revealed to them the nature of their soul, so that once they understood their soul, they could understand how to wed that soul to their higher spirit. Well, this was, in fact, the very thing that Goethe was trying to get across, which he kept calling dying and becoming. And in the ancient mysteries, whether we take the studies of Freemasonry, and I have studied Freemasonry quite thoroughly with the books that are open to the public, and you can find that it is about the death of Hiram Abiff, the builder who built King Solomon's temple for him. In this story of Masonry, which is in fact a dramatization, a play a morality teaching, more or less a fable, you find the death of Hiram Abiff. And he is killed by three forces, these three apprentices who want to get the magic word, the word that in fact gives life, the word that is behind all of physical manifestation, the spiritual word of the higher self. And so the stories of Freemasonry in the first 3 degrees are the dying and the becoming or resurrection of Hiram Abiff, the builder of King Solomon's Temple. This is, in fact, a Freemasonic story that we're talking about here because, of course, Goethe was a Freemason, and though Rudolf Steiner was not a Freemason, he was given the right to create a cognitive version of Freemasonry by Theodore Roos, and he did create the cognitive section of anthroposophy, of his spiritual science, and in it you can find many of the same elements, whether it be standard Freemasonry, Scottish or York Rite, it doesn't matter. There is death and becoming, dying and becoming, or dying and resurrection. And in the end, I'm not telling you any secret that you can't look up online or that you can't get from a book, but in the end, a special grip is given to pull Hiram from his casket, from his grave, from death into life. And this is the nature of initiation in the ancient past and the mysteries, as well as in many of the rituals found in Rosicrucianism, in alchemy, in Freemasonry, in the Knights of Columbus, and many other organizations are in fact based upon the concept that you must die and be resurrected to find your higher self, or in this case, like the chemical wedding, the king and the queen have a wedding. Or if you look at the book of Revelation, it's the lamb and basically the spirit of Sophia, the woman with the moon under her feet, crowned with the stars. And she is in New Jerusalem waiting to have this spiritual wedding. This can also be found in alchemy. So what we're looking at here is an initiation rite. It is definitely linked to Freemasonry, and I could go on with an entire lecture on just the Masonic elements that are found in this fairy tale, but one doesn't need to know any of these things to have the direct experience through the symbols of what it means to have a modern initiation. And I believe that's why Thomas Carlyle said that this was the greatest work in the last 1,000 years, because all of the mystery wisdom and the connection to the feminine, the higher spirit, which is represented by the beautiful lily, which in alchemy, literally that is the goal, is to wed with the lily, that the lion, or in this case of the Goethe's fairy tale, the youth is represented as a prince, but he's like a lion. He hasn't tamed his passions. And what does he want to do? The story opens with him being delivered across the river, which is the representation of passion, from the spiritual world into the physical world. And the first thing he wants is to find the path to the spiritual world, to find the beautiful lily, because he's going to marry her. Well, this upstart youth who doesn't seem ready for initiation has to go through a few challenges, a bit of catharsis, and in the story he dies because he touches the beautiful lily too soon. And it's not really a spoiler. I shouldn't give a spoiler alert on this, even though, in fact, I'm telling you parts of the story. Without this, you might consider this to be rather glib. Or you might, just as many people believe, that the fairy tales of the Grimm's brothers or the Russian fairy tales are, in fact, just silly little stories, but they are not. In those cases, they're not a complete story. They're not a complete cosmology. They're usually some component of the human soul that has to go through catharsis to get to the end, which is the moral education of the human being. And no matter what tradition you look in, Aegidius de Romanus, a great student of Thomas Aquinas, wrote on the education of princes. And in there you will find fairy tales. Or you can go back to the ancient teachings of the Bon culture, which was absorbed by the Tibetans. And what will you find? Fairy tales, wonder tales. You will find these everywhere. And like Novalis said, history must again become fairy tale. And that is why, in these extremely dark times, in these times that seem as if we're in the end times or an apocalypse, this story is so pertinent. And it was said, and has been said by Rudolf Steiner and many others, that Faust was Goethe's gospel, but his fairy tale of the green snake and the beautiful lily was, in fact, his apocalypse or his revelation. Now, apocalypse means uncovering of the soul. And revelation, of course, is exactly, people forget when they say revelations of St. John the Divine, they think of the end times. They think of these horrible parts of the story. But you must read the whole story of St. John the Divine. You must read the whole book of Apocalypse before you can get the story. The story has a very happy ending for those who have moral development, and a very sad, bad ending for those who do not. This is essentially what is being said in this story. And also, Goethe, at the end of Faust, basically says that the redemption of Faust is because he's being drawn upwards by the angels into the realm of the eternal feminine. And in this story, the spirit is represented by the beautiful lily, which is, of course, the eternal feminine, your higher spiritual self. Well, if we're talking about the ancient mysteries, it is important to remember that the ancient mysteries were oftentimes associated not only with mythology, but with religions, many of the traditional religions that we know of. And in many of those cases, it was a male priesthood that conducted the rites and, in fact, invented coinage. Coins were invented to pay the priests to see the wonders of the temple. And in some cases, these wonders were mechanical devices that could dispense water by simply putting a cup underneath the device and pushing a button and the water would come out, which was a tremendous wonder to the people of that time. It was almost a sign of the divine, but in essence, it was a trick of the male, patriarchal, mechanical world that we've been led into. And coinage was supposed to be used to pay for spiritual revelations, not for what we use it today, and which is controlled by the being of Mammon. And we know what Christ said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And essentially, he threw the coin changers, the people who were inside of the temple who shouldn't have been. You would take your offerings and they would then give you the coins, and then you'd give the coins to the priests, and the priests would then use that to maintain the temple. But in most of the ancient mysteries, you will find, whether it be the oracles of Delphi or the Sibylline prophecies, or wherever you look, you're going to find that it was still the feminine, even after the year 2101 BC, when the matriarchy turned into the patriarchy. You will find that the inspiration, the intuitive beings who stood behind the temple, who would be in the Holy of Holies, would be female. It would be the feminine eternal, which is what Goethe is pointing to here. And you find that in his Faust, you find it in his poetry, and you find it in this fairy tale. Some would say that there are two other fairy tales, The Night and The Mysteries, but they are not technically fairy tales per se. A fairy tale begins in a place out of space and time, and usually ends with the phrase, and if things have not changed, they are still there today. So the German fairy tales that were gathered by the Grimm's brothers used to be told every night as the sun's going down, when people had ended their toil in the day. They would gather together and they would tell the stories that they'd been told by their parents and their grandparents all the way back into time immemorial. Well, in this fairy tale, this fairy tale is embedded in the story called Conversations of German Immigrants. And so Goethe paints this picture that these people who are moving from one place to the next get together in the evening and they tell a story. And this story comes at the end of this book, Conversations of German Immigrants, and it is inserted as a story that is the story of stories. He saves it till the end because it really is the one that congeals a synthesis of what the entire German folk spirit had to say about the mystery of wedding the soul to the spirit. Now, another of my favorite fairy tales is the one that written by Novalis, um, Frederick von Hardenberg, who used the pseudonym, the writing name of Novalis. And he wrote a story called Heinrich von Oftendingen. And in my opinion, and I know other people who are scholarly who believe this is true, he was in a way giving his response to Goethe's Conversations of German Immigrants and the fairy tale of the Green Snake and Beautiful Lily. Because in this story of Heinrich von Oftendingen, at the end of the story is a fairy tale. Now, there are two fairy tales in the story, the Rose and the Hyacinth, but the second one, called the story of Eros and Fable, which is oftentimes referred to as Klingsor's fairy tale, is by far the most profound fairy tale. It is even more profound, in my opinion, than Goethe's Green Snake and Beautiful Lily. And I have yet to fathom it. And I don't know anyone who's given a full interpretation of it. Unfortunately, Rudolf Steiner did not give an interpretation of Klingsor's fairy tale. But when you look at it, you can find there also all of the elements of the ancient mysteries, including modern Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, alchemy, and many other things. So I recommend, as we do in second grade in the Waldorf curriculum, reading fairy tales. The children in the age of kindergarten, first grade, and even going into second grade still live in the archetypal realm. And so the archetypal fairy tale is, again, moral instructions to help them become the queen or the king of their own kingdom, to merge their soul qualities with their higher spiritual strivings. So one cannot demean a fairy tale without really getting into some very gray areas and getting into real problems. Because fairy tales, like fables, whether it be Aesop's fables or whether it be many of the fables that come down from the Hebrew people, from ancient India, from ancient Persia, these fables, these tales, these stories are morality teaching, and they are necessary in our age. And so someone might say, well, why in the world would I do this now when darkness seems to be encroaching upon us from all directions? Well, I'm doing it exactly because of that. When darkness arises, we must light the candle. In the Green Snake and Beautiful Lily, it's the lamp of the old man. And then later, the luminous nature of the green snake who has swallowed the gold of the will-o'-the-wisps combined, that then illuminates the past, the four kings that are in the subterranean chamber. And when this illumination happens, then the wisdom of the past, of the ancient mysteries, is transformed, and the subterranean chamber is raised up above the river of desire, and then the youth can be raised from death, and the green snake's sacrifice can turn into the most beautiful bridge between the physical and spiritual world, so that everyone can come and go across that bridge, whereas before they were only able to cross it through going into trance, through mediumship, and through all kinds of spurious ways to get across the threshold between the physical and the spiritual world. And this is, in fact, the most crucial aspect of the human being, what Goethe called dying and becoming, what the ancients called the resurrection of Hiram Abiff, of Dumuzi, of Adonis, of Dionysus, you name it. In all these ancient cultures, there's always a being who dies and is resurrected. There's the old and there's the new, and this can be found in this fairy tale. So the wisdom that Rudolf Steiner is sharing is something that he decided to do, as the ancient Greeks did. He was an art critic, and just as Goethe was somewhat of an art critic, and in Weimar he was in charge, one of the people in charge of the theater there, which led him to create his great play Faust, Part 1 and 2. Rudolf Steiner built the Goetheanum, this fantastic wooden building. Later, after it was burnt, it was replaced with the one that's there today, the Goetheanum, the second Goetheanum. And the second Goetheanum for a long time was the largest stage in Europe, where Rudolf Steiner had planned to perform Faust in its entirety for people so that they could get this wisdom, this gospel, as it was called, of Goethe through having the catharsis of witnessing this play. Rudolf Steiner also built the first Goetheanum, which was made of wood and had columns that supported two domes, two cupolas that intersected in the middle with a very large stage. And on that stage was to be performed his four mystery dramas. And these dramas are one of the first times that anyone has tried to bring the nature of the soul through multiple incarnations to life in a play. And Rudolf Steiner said that the wisdom, the Rosicrucian, alchemical, ancient wisdom that is synthesized in the four mystery dramas was inspired by the Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily. And though when you read this, it's only 20 pages, this Green Snake and Beautiful Lily of Goethe's, you really need to understand that until you read it multiple times and until those symbols become living archetypes in your soul, you will not have gleaned or plumbed the depth of what it is that can be taken from them in terms of direct instruction. Now, Tyla and my wife and I put out the Gospel of Sophia. And this Gospel of Sophia is a self-initiation process where you learn the language of the Spirit. And we give you 12 examples of different languages of the Spirit derived from ancient wisdom as well as modern. And one of them is the 22 sayings of Jesus of Nazareth, who became the Christ, as well as many ancient teachings. And these 22 letters are a part of an alphabet that can then be used to create the language of the Spirit. And that is what the 20 or so characters in the Green Snake and Beautiful Lily represent. They're the symbolic letters of an alphabet that create a language that can be applied in all aspects of your life, even today in the modern world, as we face this darkness that is all around us. And it can, in fact, light the lamp of the old man. It can, in fact, turn the green snake into a luminous green snake that makes a sacrifice of itself for all of humanity. Because the essence of this story, as well as the essence of any mystery initiation drama, is that selfishness turns into selflessness. And this is what it is trying to be indicated through these symbols. Now, we can also see that in this story, there is no end to the depth of wisdom that is implied here. But because wisdom, if you take, for instance, the attempts of combining all wisdom into Freemasonic rituals, if you take the Memphis Mizraim Lodge, there are 96, 98, it depends on which system you use, different levels that you'd have to go through. And each one of them has a mystery drama that you must go through to develop the catharsis to move from dying to becoming. Generally, in what's called the Blue Lodge of Freemasonry, there are 3 stages of initiation where Hiram Abiff, which you become the being of Hiram Abiff, you are raised from the dead. But you must go through a tremendous probationary period. You must put out tremendous amounts of effort in knowledge before you can get the wisdom that comes. Because the wisdom, as I'm saying it to you now, could seem very trite. It could seem very shallow. But it is not when you're the person who's experiencing it. And that's what we hope that you can glean from not only understanding who the characters are, but reading this incredible fairy tale, this wonder tale, this glorious tale, Tale of Tales is called, and realizing that that is your tale. It is your spiritual biography. And though you're male or female, it matters not. The youth and the beautiful lily are your soul and your spirit. And the same thing happened in The Chemical Wedding. And that's the reason that Goethe said he wanted to fashion a retelling of the chemical wedding. In that story, you have Christian Rosenkreutz, who is invited to come to this wedding. But when he gets there, he cannot believe what he has to go through. Essentially, in a nutshell, he's being raised from one level to the next, until at the top level, he gets to witness the wedding of the king and the queen, who in fact is himself. But to get there, what he has to go through is horrendous. It's terrible. And that's the reason that I wanted to make sure to present this now. Oftentimes we're talking about geopolitical things. We're getting into tremendous verifiable, uh, uh, provable evidence about the nature of the world around us, bringing forth a lot of the painful truth that many don't wish to hear. But in this case, I believe that we're giving, through this article and through presenting to you an archetypal story that can basically lead you on the way through self-initiation to the language of the spirit, through these archetypal letters that become a language of the spirit. And this is, in fact, the antidote for our age. It's the antidote for any age, as Thomas Carlyle said, in the last 1,000 years. Rudolf Steiner said that if you understand the green snake and the beautiful lily for what it is the summary of what the human being needs more than anything else from the time of, well, to give the dates for that, 1415, when the consciousness soul began to be birthed in the human development, for 2,160 years. So Carlyle wasn't wrong when he said that it was the greatest performance or the greatest creative gift in the last 1,000 years. Rudolf Steiner says that it goes on for 2,160 years, that what is implied in the archetypes and the symbols in this story are exactly what is needed as the antidote to the modern world to help the consciousness soul develop out the characteristic inside of it called the spiritual soul, which is attempting to wed with what Rudolf Steiner calls one of the three elements of the spirit world that he calls the spirit self. In modern parlance, we would call that the lower self, or the common self in the physical world, with your higher self. And what happens to do so? Well, you must leave the physical world, go across the threshold between the physical and spiritual, and enter into the spiritual world to gain access to the spirit self, to gain access to the realm of the angels. And this is not easy to do. As you face the threshold and you wish to cross it, it's like crossing burning ground. It's like going down to the water of the unconscious and drowning yourself. It's like dying and becoming. And the thing about crossing the threshold is, if you do not have moral development, then even when you're across the threshold in the realm of the angels, in the realm of your higher self, which Rudolf Steiner says is a higher form of thinking called imagination, not fantasy, but imagination. If you're in that realm and you're there without moral development, or what the mysteries and the ancient initiations always demanded was the perfection of your body of desires called the astral body. If you had not gone through probation and you had not proven yourself worthy, they would not give you the initiation, because in fact it would be dangerous for you, because in reality it is a mock death. And it is so profound that if you get lost on that side and you come back and you do not have moral development, if you do not have the freedom out of love, if you haven't developed love for all other beings out of freedom, not out of necessity, but out of freedom, then you will not be able to remember what you experienced there, and it will not inspire you to help others, and it will not give you the courage that you need to live your life. So this is an initiation process, and that is the reason that we gave our book, the trilogy, which is found for free online, and it's a process of initiation, self-initiation. We don't need a guru, a male priest. We don't need the ancient mysteries. We don't need the 96 levels of the Memphis Mizraim Freemasonic rite or any other rite of the ancient mysteries. We don't need to truly understand and comprehend the hieroglyphs of the Egyptians, which were in fact a mystery language. We don't need to understand the 7 mysteries that surrounded Athens, the mysteries of Eleusis, of Samothrace, the mysteries of Dodona, all of these, the mysteries of Aeschylus and drama, the mysteries of Dionysus. We don't need to understand all of those. Those are wonderful for history. And in The Green Snake and Beautiful Lily, there are 2 characters that I had trouble for many decades understanding, and now I realize I was one of them. There are 2 characters called the Will-o'-the-Wisps. And they have the characteristic that they suck gold from every place that they find it, but then they carelessly and capriciously just cast off the gold as gold coins everywhere they go. Well, this gold and these gold coins are in fact the wisdom of the past that I've been describing, these ancient mysteries, which can be gleaned to a degree by a pure heart from religion. But in essence, oftentimes gathering this gold leads to mammon and does not lead to the gold that is wisdom. And so Goethe characterizes this by having the snake, when the snake and the old man with the lamp, and the snake has already eaten some of these gold coins of the will-o'-the-wisps that cast them off carelessly into a meadow, the green snake eats them. And by the way, the river of passions can't handle that. If the gold coins would have fallen into the river would have swollen and destroyed the ferryman who crosses that river and the will-o'-the-wisps themselves. But when the snake eats some gold coins and goes into the subterranean chasm, through the chasm into the subterranean temple, and there meets the 4 kings, the old man with the lamp is there. And now when the light of the old man and the illumination of the snake and the light of the old man is the wisdom of ancient religions, they will really help you. They can't illumine things until you have the selfless nature of the green snake there as a luminous being. And when they join together in this subterranean chamber of initiation, which most initiations started in the ancient past in caves, in darkness, and then they were slowly brought to light. When the 4 kings, the gold, silver, bronze, and mixed kings, are then shown to be who they are, the snake begins to have a conversation with the gold king. And the gold king asks a question which is the first question in Freemasonry: from whence came ye? Now, that question is a mystery initiation question. In other words, if someone was to say to you, where do you come from? Your answer will tell everything about who you are. Many people believe there's no pre-birth kingdom that they came from, which is the garden of the beautiful lily. Many people don't believe in such things. And so your answer in Masonry, the answer is from the 2 Johns of Jerusalem. In other words, the 2 Johns are the great mystery of the followers of Christ. So the gold king says to the snake, who is now somewhat illuminated, the green snake, and says, from whence come ye? And the green snake answers, from the chasms where the gold dwells. And the gold king then asks, what is grander than gold? And the snake answers, light. And the gold king then asks the snake, what is more refreshing than light? And the snake answers, conversation or speech, depending upon how you wish to interpret it. I like the interpretation in the translation conversation, because the name of the book that this story, this tale of tales was found in was Conversations of German Immigrants. And in these conversations, they would have been telling the stories of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, because it was one of the stories that German immigrants, and German immigrants implies in my mind, the wandering Unity Brethren, the Bohemians, the Gypsies, who had this wisdom but were basically displaced and wandered throughout Europe and ended up in all of the cities of Europe, but they were called gypsies. They were still outcasts. And so the conversations of these German immigrants would have been telling these kind of stories. The same thing happens in Novalis' story of Heinrich von Oftendingen. In the evening, they would gather together and they would tell these stories. And there are the stories of the Minnesingers and the Meistersingers who would have competitions of who could tell the best story. And these were, of course, the German Holy Grail lore. So even the stories of the Holy Grail, which there are many of, are telling in many, many cases the story of Jesus of Nazareth and how he became Christ. In other words, how he died and was reborn, resurrected, or dying and becoming. And this is the secret that would make the best story. And this is why Klingzor, the evil Klingzor in these legends of the these contests of singing of these stories, much like the troubadours, the Minnesingers, he had the power to tell of the stories that gave the greatest catharsis because he focused on crossing that river, the river of desires. And until you have tamed that river, until you have the gold that can illumine you from the past in you, which can be derived also from simply having a pure heart, and until you have the wisdom of the old man in the lamp, and until you have been that impetuous youth who demands upon entering the physical world to return to the spiritual world immediately and wed your spiritual self before you go through the proper probation or the proper catharsis, then you cannot actually understand what it is to say that where you come from is the realm of gold. But light is greater than that. And even greater than that is conversation. Because conversation implies that one person is being selfless enough to listen to another and then having a self strong enough to be able to tell their story also so that it brings wisdom to the ears of others who listen to it. So this story, I highly recommend to you. I recommend that you read it in its entirety, and you can read it first, or you can read the synopsis and the commentary on who the cast of characters are and Rudolf Steiner's other commentary on it, or you can read it for what it is and just find in it this incredible story that is, according to Carlyle, the greatest story told in the last 1,000 years, and according to Rudolf Steiner, the very story that will lead us on into the future for another 1,000 years or more. Rudolf Steiner also said that the story of the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, is in fact characteristic of what is needed in our particular time, which he calls the epic of the consciousness soul. And when you look at this story, you'll find three characters: Wainamoinen, the old singer who sang all things into creation after his mother, Ilmatar, gave him birth, because always in all traditional religions or mythologies and epics or in great stories, you will find that the feminine is always there from the beginning in one form or the other. So though Wainamoinen sung everything into existence, and his brother Ilmarinen, the great smithy, the forgeman, who was able to forge anything that was necessary in creation, and then the youth, Youkahainen, no, excuse me, there is Youkahainen, but there's Lemminkainen. You have to kind of merge those two together. Lemminkainen is like the youth. The old man with the lamp in the Green Snake and Beautiful Lily is like Wainamoinen. And the snake is very much like Ilmarinen, the smithy who's able to forge the Sampo, this magical mill, which is indicative of the threefold nature of the human being, that can grind out meal, in other words, food, salt, in other words, all the metal mineral substances that keep us alive, and gold. So the coinage, there again, you have these three natures being birthed by the Sampo, which has to be forged. It has to go through this process. And Wainamoinen, Ilmarinen, and Lemminkainen all have to travel from where they live into the far north to try to find a rainbow maiden for them to marry. Well, if you look closely at the green snake and beautiful lily, you'll find it has many similar fairy tale characteristics to what is being given in Goethe's Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily. And Rudolf Steiner said that it is the epic story that we should read at our time to give us the soul nourishment that we need to help us find our spiritual nature. It is, in fact, another initiation cycle. And when you look at any mythology, it is very important to remember that all the characters, the entire pantheon of that mythology, are characteristics of your own soul and spirit. All of the gods of the Greeks and the goddesses of the Greeks are you. The entire pantheon of the many gods and goddesses found in ancient Hindu beliefs in ancient India, those are all you. The Egyptian gods and goddesses are all characteristics of you. So you don't need to study these ancient things. You need to embody them, and you need to understand that inside of you are the answers to these mysteries, the answers to what it would be needed to become initiated into the wedding of your soul to your spirit. So I highly recommend that in these days, that this apocalypse of Goethe, this revelations of Goethe, is most pertinent for our time, and it is the very thing that we need as an antidote to the darkness that gathers around us like the subterranean chamber, that then brings it into light so that your own personal self-development can go from necessity to freedom, from dullness to blessedness, as in the Holy Grail stories, or from this particular obsession that we have in our modern age with selfishness into a selflessness for the sake of all mankind, all humankind. And so this would be, in my opinion, the absolute quickest route to understand that, if one could then glean the archetypal meanings of these symbols in Goethe's Green Snake and Beautiful Lily. But you can also study the Kalevala, which is another way to look at what it is that we're going through. And it has, just like in the Green Snake and Beautiful Lily, the elements of dying and becoming. In our age now, we're looking at the dying of Western culture, the decline of Western culture, which was predicted by Oswald Spengler and Jean Gebser and many others who have studied history, show that we go through cycles of becoming, cycles of dying and becoming, dying and being resurrected. The Hindus believe that there's the god of creation, the god of death, and the god of resurrection or maintenance, Vishnu, who again and again, after birth and death, create rebirth. And this is the nature of what is the ubiquitous triple goddess that is found in all cultures before 2100 BC. It is the goddess of birth, death, and rebirth. And so I highly commend this story to you, and I recommend that you understand that in our time, we should not hang so tightly onto our materialistic views of things, but realize that as they were born, so shall they die, and later they will be resurrected.